Catholic anthropology, here we go. Okay, we are born good. We're made in the image and likeness of God. We're also fallen. So we live in a world with natural disasters, evil, and suffering. All of those things are allowed. But we are redeemed. Thankfully, Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross has saved us from sin and depravity. And therefore we have hope. Jesus has conquered death, and so what is there to be afraid of? And our suffering is not in vain. This is one of the things I think that as Catholics we have such a leg up on everybody else, which is that suffering is not in vain. It can be used for our sanctification and the good of other people. And so let's talk a little bit about health. Often we separate these things, body, mind, spirit, they're in separate buckets, so to speak. We're actually much more connected than that. So when we talk about physical health, we can talk about illness and we can talk about injury. So an acute illness is something that's short-lived and only lasts a little while, such as the flu. You might also have a chronic illness like diabetes that is a lifelong condition that has to be managed. We can also have injury, right? So you might break your arm skateboarding, you get a cast and it heals. You can also have a chronic injury. An example of that would be a traumatic brain injury, which has lingering effects that last for many, many years, sometimes a lifetime. The same thing is true for mental health. So we can have an illness that is short-lived. So situational depression, you might have experienced this if you had a circumstance, let's say you moved to a new city, and you don't know anybody, it takes a while to get acclimated, you may experience symptoms of depression until you get yourself connected and reinvigorated in that new city. You can also have chronic mental illness. Major depressive disorder is an example of that. It could last, for some people, they experience that for decades in their lifetime. We can also have mental health injuries. So you might have an acute, short-lived period of time where you experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you fell off your skateboard, now you're afraid to skateboard, you don't want to go near the place where the injury happened, those are some of the symptoms you might experience, but it can resolve itself in a relatively brief time. But there is chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's particularly seen for people who have been veterans of military service, who've seen combat, or people who've experienced ongoing traumas in their life. Chronic health conditions often lead to symptoms of mental health problems, especially anxiety and depression. So if you have been diagnosed with cancer, diabetes, an autoimmune disorder, you have experienced a traumatic brain injury, those are examples of chronic conditions that people often then end up experiencing both anxiety and depression as a result of those diagnoses. If you have a chronic mental health condition, it usually involves some sort of physical symptoms as well. So for example, if you experience depression, you may have insomnia, headaches, fatigue, chronic pain, diarrhea, other digestive types of issues. And if you experience an anxiety disorder, you may have panic attacks, an increased heart rate, headaches, muscle pain, an upset stomach, or nausea. Many causes of mental health problems also have physical consequences. And mental illness worsens the prognosis of a range of physical illnesses, especially heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. So it's not just enough to treat the physical health symptoms. We have to also treat the mental health symptoms. So as you can see, our mind, body, and spirit work together. They're highly integrated. And so if we're going to experience wholeness and wellness, we need to address all of these different aspects of our one body. So let's talk about stigma. Why are we afraid of mental illness? Well, we're afraid of mental illness in part because of the historic misunderstanding of causes. People just didn't know as much as we know today. We don't know everything, but we know more. So it was always thought that you were possessed, that you were cursed, you must have done something wrong, and you were being punished by God. The treatments have not always been great. You might have been chained up, locked up, beaten if you had a severe mental illness. And there's a current connection of criminal behavior with mental illness. So you've probably heard, unfortunately, Colorado has a number of mass shootings that we have experienced in this state. And when that happens and you hear a news report about that, how often do you hear that the perpetrator of that crime has a history of mental illness? And so what ends up happening is that there is this assumption that the mental illness caused that criminal behavior. And that's just simply not the case. In only about 3 to 5% of violent crimes is the mental illness the cause of that behavior. And so it's important that we separate mental illness from violent criminal behavior. The vast majority of people who live with mental illness are not dangerous. And if anyone is going to hurt someone because of their mental illness, it's more often that they're going to harm themselves instead of other people. So mental illness is unseen. You don't have a cast on your leg, you're not in a wheelchair, it's not obvious to the people in your life that you are experiencing a serious health condition. And so it makes it harder for people to understand and accept that. None of us want to be sick. We don't want to be different. We don't want to be outcasted, right? And as parents especially, we do not want our children, no matter what age they are, to suffer, to be different, and to be outcasted from society. And then, of course, there's the very real fear of suicide. And so this is one of the issues that people end up being very afraid that the person that they know and love who has a serious mental illness might make this choice. So why we don't need to be afraid of mental illness. If Jesus came to earth, he died for our sins, and he has risen, we don't have to be afraid. We're not alone in our suffering. He knows what we're experiencing, and he will be with us. The other reasons are that we understand a lot more now about mental illness, and we actually have treatments that are much more humane and that can often be very effective for people. So we don't need to be afraid of having a diagnosis of a mental health disorder because we have ways to treat it. So mental illness is a condition that affects a person's thinking, feelings, behavior, and mood. How do we diagnose those things? So the way we diagnose mental illness is looking at the symptoms. So the number of symptoms, the intensity of those symptoms, and the duration of those symptoms. All of those factors make a difference in the type of diagnosis that a person might receive. And then there's a continuum of severity. So you could have a mental illness and it might be very mild. It might be more moderate, or it could be very severe. So factors that influence each of our personal experiences of mental illness are genetics. So what did your parents or grandparents experience? If you know that there might be a history of mental illness, whether it's diagnosed or not, often there are stories that people can make conclusions about. Even if somebody did not have an actual diagnosis, you may know very clearly that there is something there that probably indicated a mental health issue. And then the life events that you've experienced personally. It's different for each person. And so the things that you have faced in your life are going to contribute to the possibility of having a mental illness. Your particular brain chemistry, the type, amount, the way that the chemicals in your brains move, all of those things are going to impact whether and how you experience a mental illness. And then your personality. We're each different. We're different in how we look at the world, how we interpret the events that happen to us. And so we are going to react to our life events and to the things that happen to us in a unique way. So let's talk a little bit about common types of mental health diagnoses. These are things that you probably have all heard about. We have different categories. So the neurodevelopmental disorders would include things like autism, ADHD, or learning disabilities such as dyslexia. The psychotic disorders, one example of that is schizophrenia. There are mood disorders, so that would include bipolar disorder and clinical depression. And anxiety disorders, there are a lot of these. So there's generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, or PTSD. We, of course, have eating disorders, and then personality disorders. Personality disorders are lifelong patterns of the way that people think about, behave in the world, interact with other people, and they're typically long-standing. They develop when we're relatively young, and they continue throughout our lifetime. So let's talk about the prevalence of mental illness. 1 in 5 US adults lives with a mental illness. 19% of those people experience some type of anxiety disorder. 7% will have experienced a major depressive disorder. 1 in 6 adolescents ages 12 to 17 has a diagnosable mental illness. 11% of those experience an anxiety disorder. 7% is a behavior disorder like ADHD. 6% will experience depression. So this is much more common than people often think. What are the treatment possibilities for people? So one of the things that's important for some people is psychological testing. So a psychologist is the one who would conduct some sort of test, a series of tests really. If you need a diagnosis for something like a learning disability, an attention deficit disorder, we're the people who are going to be able to help identify that so that that student can get accommodations at school. And then psychotherapy. There's lots of different types of psychotherapy. You can go as an individual, you can go with your spouse or your future spouse, you can be part of a group of people who experience something similar to you. We also have family therapy. So those are the options. It's really important to have a good fit, to trust the person that you're working with, and that you really click with them and you like the way that they work. And so sometimes it takes more than one therapist to find somebody that you feel is a good fit for you. But that's going to make all the difference in making progress in treatment. And then often lifestyle changes are recommended. Sometimes people need to start practicing things like relaxation, meditation, trying to help themselves reduce, let's say, anxiety or other things. And then medication may be helpful for some people. That might be through a primary care doctor or a psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist has a medical degree. So as a psychologist, I have a doctorate, but it's different. I'm not a medical doctor and I can't prescribe medication for people. But a psychiatrist is someone who specializes in mental health issues and prescribing the right types of medication for that. Medication is often an important component of treatment for people who have more severe ADHD or depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Let's talk a little bit about medication, because people are sometimes actually afraid of taking medication. I hear this very frequently, that people are really, really concerned about the idea of taking medication or their child taking medication, which makes a lot of sense, and yet medication is just a tool, okay? It is not the thing that is going to change everything, but it is one component of a comprehensive treatment program. And we always want to try other options first. It's not just that we go to medication as the very first thing that we recommend to people. Do you need to change your diet? Do you need to include exercise? Can you incorporate meditation to help reduce anxiety or other symptoms? If you have a learning disability or you have an attention disorder, we're going to suggest lots of school and home strategies to help make your life easier. And then there are times when medication makes all the difference. So there are some folks who experience ADHD or bipolar disorder, or depression or schizophrenia, who honestly could not be functioning if they did not have medication. And that usually is an indication that there is something about their brain chemistry that just does not allow them to function in the world unless they have some chemical help. And then we monitor that person closely. And a therapist can be really helpful with this because we usually see people once a week and we can see week to week, how are they doing? Is the medication helping? Are there negative side effects? What's going on? And then here's the great thing about medication, you can always stop taking it. You don't have to keep taking it if it's not working for you or if you don't like the side effects. But the thing that's so critical is that you stop taking that medication with the help of your doctor. Sometimes people think that they can just stop and there's not going to be any repercussions. And actually, if you're taking a medication for a mental health disorder, you really want to be communicating with your doctor and following their exact recommendations about how to get off of that medication or transition onto a different medication. Let's talk a little bit about antidepressants, because there's a real controversy over this. You've probably heard that medication for depression can increase suicidality in teenagers. And so what we're talking about is a group, a category of antidepressants called SSRIs. That stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Basically what it does, it allows more serotonin to be available in the brain, which is kind of a feel-good chemical for us. And so there can be what's called a rollback effect for some antidepressants, where it might increase energy levels slightly in some people, and this might cause increasing acting on suicidal thoughts or impulses. There was a study of 2,200 teens who were taking SSRIs, and there were no completed suicides from the teenagers who were taking those medications. So why I say this is a controversy is that there are, some information out there and some people who have said, well, this is the reason why my student or my loved one took their own life, when in fact it doesn't mean that that's the case at all. So we hear stories about people who have been taking medications and they've attempted suicide, they might have completed suicide, but it's important that we consider the following. So, people are not always correctly diagnosed. This is not an exact science. We cannot take, blood work and figure out exactly what's going on with you. We are doing this from report. We're just hearing people's reports of their symptoms. And so sometimes people are not correctly diagnosed. Sometimes they're not prescribed the right medication. And then patients do not always take the medication as directed. And so sometimes people stop abruptly with that medication. Sometimes they mix it with other medications that their doctor doesn't know they're taking. And sometimes they're using alcohol or illicit drugs at the same time. And so there are situations where you may have heard stories about people and the assumption is that it has to do with the medication they were taking, but often we do not know the other circumstances, the other things that they were ingesting at that time. And so it's important that people need to be monitored closely when they're taking antidepressants, that's true. But the best course of action, especially for severe depression, is weekly therapy with medication. The medication itself is not enough, typically. It needs to be in conjunction with weekly therapy for people to get better. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the variables that influence the length and treatment of outcomes. So if you have adverse childhood experiences, what are called ACEs, just a few of these: childhood abuse, poverty, divorce, those things are going to make treatment often take a little bit longer. If you have previous trauma, that's going to complicate the treatment, and it's going to also change the outcome of your experience, and you probably will need a little bit more intensive therapy. The length of the mental illness that you're experiencing and the severity. The more severe the mental illness, the more challenging the treatment, the longer that it can take, and that can change the outcome as well. The compliance with treatment. So if you are engaged, if you are doing the things that your doctor and your therapist ask you to do, then it's usually going to help shorten the length of treatment, and you're going to have a better prognosis. If you're abusing alcohol or illicit drugs while you are in treatment, it's really going to slow things down, and you're not going to make very much progress. How much social support a person has also influences this. So people who have a broader social network, who have people that they can rely on, actually can do really well in terms of treatment and having a positive outcome. And unfortunately, socioeconomic status has something to do with this, right? So if you have more money, more resources, that usually means you have more time and money to be able to spend on therapy, on different treatment modalities, and so your outcomes are going to be better. And then if there's a presence of a personality disorder, that will complicate therapy. It just makes it more challenging. We have to pay attention to different factors, both for the personality issues as well as, let's say, the anxiety or the depression that a person might be experiencing.
Can you give an example of a personality disorder and how that's different from the other things you were talking about?
Antisocial personality disorder is a good example of somebody who really does not interested in social contact, doesn't want to have close, mutually satisfying relationships with people, often has kind of their own interest at heart. You might hear this a person being called a sociopath. So really does not care very much about the rights and needs of the people around them, but really is out for their own kind of benefit and gain. Yeah.
Is that the same thing as narcissism?
So a little bit different, but yeah, definitely components. So she asked, is that the same as narcissism? So narcissistic personality disorder is, again, so when we talk about personality disorders, we're talking about people who have long-standing patterns, and in order to meet that criteria, you have to have, this idea of enough of these symptoms and the intensity of them and severity of them to qualify. So we all know people who have narcissistic traits. Actually, having some component of narcissism is helpful for us, because then we can take our own interests into account and we can make decisions independent of other people. But then it can rise to a level where it is damaging, right? And so that's the point where we start to get into how many of these behaviors do you have? How many of these, characteristics do you have? And how severe is it? If it's negatively impacting your work relationships, your marriage, your ability to have a harmonious family life, then that's the point where it might rise to the level of being a disorder, if that makes sense. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about COVID anxiety right now, since this is particularly important to our current situation and life right now. Okay, we've all felt COVID anxiety. I mean, it's just been kind of crazy. 42% of adults have experienced mental health problems related to the virus and the prevention strategies that, shutting down businesses and so forth, everybody staying at home. So that was a survey that was taken in June. So before the pandemic even happened, adults' main sources of stress were job, money, and health. What do you think the sources of stress are now? Jobs, money, and health, right? Because all of those things have been negatively impacted because of COVID and the way that we're responding to COVID. So it's really a challenging situation right now. So anxiety helps us survive. When our brain sends out a threat signal, our body releases hormones like adrenaline that make us immediately stronger and faster so that we can fight, we can flee, or we can freeze. The problem is that, we have these stress hormones, and if they're happening multiple times a day, your blood sugar is going up, your heart rate's increasing, your blood pressure is going up, your pulse is quickening, your pupils are dilating, you're breathing shallowly, right? Because we have this ongoing barrage of information. If you've ever experienced watching the news or opening up an email and it feels like a grenade just went off in your living room, that's an example of these stress hormones and the chemistry that we're experiencing related to anxiety. But COVID anxiety is worse. So let's talk a little bit about why. Because it's new and unknown. Okay, human beings hate things that we don't know about, especially if it can kill us. It's invisible, we cannot see it. So it's not like you can swerve out of the way like you would if there was a moving car coming towards you. We can't see it. And it's spread by other people just breathing, which makes our social interactions very awkward. If you're highly concerned about this and you are afraid of getting close to people, it really negatively impacts our social relationships. And then we have this constant barrage of information, right? Which is a lot of times saying contradictory things. Do we need to wear masks? Do we not need to wear masks? What's happening? How serious is this? And so it really makes it challenging, and it keeps us in a high state of anxiety because we don't always know what the information is or what information we can trust. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. The oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So when do we need to seek help for anxiety and stress? If you're finding yourself easily irritated and you're snapping at people, if you're drinking, smoking, or eating excessively to cope, which many people have been doing during this lockdown COVID recovery time, if you're having digestive problems like ulcers or irritable bowel syndrome, if you're having tension headaches, difficulty sleeping, feeling overwhelmed, burnt out, depressed, you feel excessively fatigued at the end of the day, not just your regular everyday tiredness, but really fatigued. And if you don't want to be around people, then that's a good sign that you want to seek some help for anxiety and stress.